everybody. We are making cherry pudding cake. So a couple of weeks ago, I did a batch of clafouti, which is basically cherries in a custard. So this is cherries that are baked into more of a cake rather than a custard. And this original recipe, kind of a fun story behind it. When my dad passed away, he liked to cook, and I was cleaning out the house, and there were a whole bunch of newspaper recipes that he had clipped out of the newspaper over the years. There was a big stack of them, and this is one of the recipes that was in there. I don't know if he ever actually made it, and it originally calls for cranberries. Which is a really fun recipe to do around the holidays. But it works with pretty much any kind of fruit, particularly stone fruit. And we are at the very, very tail end of cherry season. These are not my cherries. A friend of mine who farms in a town about an hour away from me stopped in. They were at the farmer's market, working the farmer's market here in Walla Walla, and they stopped in after the farmer's market. And I ended up giving her some canned goods that I was working on, and she said, "Is there anything you want?" And I said, we had all the cherries that we picked, and we mostly threw them in the freezer, and I kind of forgot to actually just eat some. And if you have extra cherries, I would love some extra cherries. And so they had a little bit of extra cherries. This was their last farmer's market for cherries. And they gave me a ridiculous amount of cherries. It was probably 4 or 5 pounds. So I ended up with this extra added bounty of cherries, and these have been sitting on the counter since Saturday, and it's now Wednesday. And so I thought I would just use them up in this lovely pudding cake. So these are just, not sure what the variety is on these. They're a little bit firm, and they're just slightly past their prime, but so I just pitted them, and you need about 2 cups of fruit. The original recipe calls for 2 cups of cranberries. This is a little over 2 cups of cherries. I'm going to just cut them in half once I pitted them, just so they're not quite so chunky. But it's actually cranberries and almonds, and so cherries and almonds are a beautiful match, and so this is going to be a really lovely cake. I need a half a cup of almonds. This would also totally work with frozen cherries, so you could make this at a different part of the year. You don't have to make it when cherries are in season if you've got frozen cherries in your freezer, which I highly encourage you to do. It's a really lovely fruit to have on hand. All right, the original recipe is for cranberries. Cranberries are very sour. You cannot eat them out of hand without sweetening them first. So I'm going to assume this recipe has a lot more sugar in it than is really necessary. And so I'm going to make an executive decision here to cut the sugar that the cherries are macerating in by half. And macerating is just a term for when you take raw fruit and you coat it in sugar, and the sugar acts similar to what salt would do, and it pulls out moisture, and so it starts to soften the fruit and release a bunch of juice. And so that's what's going to happen here. So we're going to set that aside, and we're going to make the batter. So this calls for a 1/4 cup of butter, melted and then at room temperature, which is a bit of a heavy lift. So I'm going to melt this, but just barely. These little things are great. I'll put a link in the description below. They are to replace Saran wrap. That's gonna melt pretty quickly because it's not frozen. So I need to cream together 2 eggs, a half a cup of sugar, and a 1/4 cup of butter. A 1/4 cup is about 4 tablespoons of butter. And I'm going to use brown sugar in this instead of white sugar. Another random executive decision. I just think it would be tasty with a little brown sugar. I'm a fan of brown sugar. And there's no other added spices in this, so I'm going to add a little. Use brown sugar instead of white sugar for this part, just because I think that added molasses is going to taste lovely. And that's all brown sugar is white sugar with molasses, or more to the point, molasses comes from raw sugar, and so when you remove it, you get white sugar. Okay. So this says melted butter at room temperature. So what I'm kind of doing is splitting the difference here. It's obviously been in a microwave. It's pretty hot, but the center of it isn't completely melted. And we need to beat this until light and fluffy for a couple of minutes. And it's funny, I almost never use this, but I've had it for, gosh, I probably had this thing for 30 years. Sunbeam Mixmaster, still works. I think we're there. Half cup all-purpose flour. So the only leavening in this is from the beaten eggs, which is why they have you beat it for 2 minutes. So don't skimp on that. It's gonna seem like it's fine to just whisk it together. You really want it to lighten up and be fluffy, because this is the only thing that's gonna make this thing rise, is the air that you've whipped into there. I need a half a cup of all-purpose flour. My poor man's sifting method right there. Actually, interestingly, these canisters also came out of my dad's house, and I wish I could still find them. I really love them, and they don't make them anymore. I've looked. I love this release lid on here that is airtight, or relatively airtight. We once had an infestation of meal moths. If you've ever gone through that, it is a nightmare. And the nice thing about these is the moths couldn't get into the stuff that was inside the canisters, even though they tried. So very effective, large scale storage. And I like glass for a lot of things, but I'm not a big fan of it for things like sugar and flour. Big things where you're going to have 5 pounds of something in there, and if you drop it in glass, it's just going to be a huge nightmare. So I do like a plastic container for things like that. Okay, so this is our batter. That's done. And this, what's great about this recipe is it's really fast and simple. Other than the part where you have to mix, but at least you didn't have to separate any eggs. So I'm just going to spray this generously with some nonstick. I'm going to give this one more quick stir. These cherries are not particularly juicy. At least not yet. I imagine if we let them sit for a lot longer, they would be, but I'm not going to be too precious about it. Try to make sure that we get an even distribution on those nuts so that we don't have a whole bunch of nuts in one corner and none in the other. And then you just pour the batter over the cake or over the fruit. This is such an easy dessert. And you could play around with this. I imagine it would be really good with a little bit of extract of one kind or another, like an orange extract or a lemon extract, or even just some vanilla would be good in here. Depending on the fruit, you could totally play with that. All right, that's going to spread out as it heats in the oven. I'm not going to worry about getting it all the way to the very edge. All right. All right, so let's get this in the oven. 325 for about 45 minutes until light golden brown. So we'll check back. Let's check back in 40 minutes and see how it looks. All right, so it ended up being 45 minutes. I checked it at 40, wasn't quite brown enough. So went another 5. And now we're looking lovely. You can see how that batter has spread out all the way to the edges. So there was no need to smooth that out. It's nicely browned. And pretty much ready to go. All right, I'll show you in a few minutes once it's cooled off and we decide to cut it. Our cherry pudding bake it's probably been out of the oven about 20 minutes. Still warm, but cooled off quite a bit. I always cut these into 8 pieces and then end up eating 2 pieces. Who am I kidding? I would like to believe that I'm only going to eat 1. Because it's a pudding, don't expect it to be completely cake-like. It should have some goo. That's part of the point. I hate getting the first piece out. Yeah, not too bad. Second one is always easier. And this is really good with vanilla ice cream. I am going to serve this with a little bit of whipped cream, just because I happen to have some leftover whipped cream in the fridge. So there you go. Cherry pudding bake. But again, think of this as a blank slate for all kinds of summer fruits. It would be delicious with almost anything. Enjoy. And cheers to my dad, who gave me my love of baking.